Yesterday we had the end of a court process and the sentencing of two teenage boys for a horrific murder of a young girl in the prime of her life. I think it was probably the most extreme example of sexual assault and misogyny the country has seen, and obviously we want to send solidarity to her family. Last month the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre stated there was a public health epidemic of sexual violence. This time last year, thousands of people shared online pictures of their underwear with the hashtag "This is not consent" in response to victim blaming in rape trials, and Ireland trended worldwide, and we had to bring the issue graphically into the chamber. A year on, Taoiseach, I want to ask you, what has your government actually done about gender-based violence? Because barristers are still trotting out the same old rape myths. In a recent trial, that it wasn't even contested the complainant was savagely beaten. The barrister suggested she'd still consented to the sex. Quote, "She's a whirly young girl," she's aged 20, by the way, "with experience of life, she knew what she was doing." Women are wondering why we bothered putting consent into a definition of consent into the law. It's not worth the paper it's written on. In another court this week, a complainant who was raped by two men, allegedly, is told by the barrister she consented, she wasn't drunk enough, and she had the presence of mind to fix her skirt. So being beaten, being raped multiple times, even having video evidence, doesn't seem to be enough to be believed. Is it any wonder we've reports of famous sports celebrities strutting around with impunity despite sexual assault allegations? Are women to go into hiding every time such a figure decides to go on a night out? Now, following protests after the Belfast rape trial, you commissioned the O'Malley report. It was meant to report last year. Here we are, the end of 2017, or 2019 almost. You know the figures already, I won't repeat them, but 10 women are murdered annually, 1 in 3 are coercively controlled, and 1 in 4 have experienced physical and sexual violence. And you have to judge how important a government considers an issue by how much funding it gives. And your government gave 25 million to the entire support sector, but yet you saw fit to give 17 million to a cruel and ailing greyhound industry. Because of Me Too and more disclosure, obviously you think that's fine, but most of us don't. Rape crisis centres have a massive increase in calls, and the increase that you gave goes no way to meeting the demand. Why aren't groups going into schools, educating young people about the signs of abusive relationships? Instead, we actually have a culture, Hollywood movies, etc., that normalise toxic behaviour by calling jealousy and manipulation romance. So I put it to you, Taoiseach, that we have to conclude that unless people go out and protest, unless they stage walkouts in Google or McDonald's or wherever else, nothing seems to happen in here in relation to these issues. And on the 3 counts, Count Corla, of how complainants are treated in court, funding and education, you've failed abysmally over the last year.
Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputy, for raising this important matter. And first of all, I'd like to say that my condolences and also my heart goes out to the parents of Anna Creedon. I saw them speaking there yesterday, and I just can't imagine what they're going through and what they will go through for the rest of their lives because of what happened to their beautiful daughter. There is an epidemic of gender-based violence in Ireland and indeed across the world, and it does need to stop. And you asked me what the government is doing about it, and we're doing quite a lot. First of all, we've finally ratified the Istanbul Convention, long overdue, but has been done by this government of Fine Gael independence, not done by many other governments that could have done so in the past. We've modernised our laws around sexual offences, and they've been strengthened in recent years through the Criminal Law Sexual Offences Act and also the Victims of Crime Act, making, for example, coercive control an offence, changing our laws around consent, for example, and strengthening them in a way that needed to be done, in my view. There's also improved recording of sexual assault, and there's work now with the Office of the Attorney General around the Harmful Harassment Communications and Related Offences Bill. And we are next going to introduce a distinct offence of stalking to provide for 2 offences to deal with non-consensual recording and distribution of intimate images. And I know the Labour Party has been very involved in working with us on that. And we need to ensure that proposed image-based offences will cover recording and distribution of sexual assaults, and the Joint Oireachtas Committee report will be considered in full once the committee has done their report. The Gardaí are also continuously improving their specialist services, responding to the needs of victims. The Commissioner is now ruling out digital protective service units with specially trained officers to engage with and interview victims, so they're better trained and know how to deal with victims of sexual violence. They'll also Minister Flanagan has launched the No Excuses campaign, and that's a 3-year national awareness raising campaign on sexual harassment and sexual violence that was launched back in May. And the campaign aims to increase awareness of sexual violence and to bring about changes in societal attitudes, which you spoke about earlier, with the aim of decreasing and preventing these offences. And I'm pleased to say that a second burst of that campaign commenced just back on the 2nd of October. In terms of funding, TUSLA has statutory responsibility for the care and protection of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, and the budget for that has increased by 20% under this government to 25.3 million. In addition to that, there's a further 1.7 million being made available by the Department of Justice to support 57 organisations who support victim support services, and a further 2 million is allocated in the budget for 2020 to assist those services next year.
Taoiseach, you can sign up to conventions, you can put laws on the statute books. They're, relatively easy things and important things to do. But unless they're actually backed up and make change, which, if you read any court reports, the definition of consent, which I argued for myself, spoke at the committee about, doesn't seem to be having one jot of an impact. The No Excuses campaign I welcome, but the difficulty is it encourages more people to disclose, but will they get the help? Because the rape crisis centres, the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, have said they've had a 25% increase in phone calls as a result of Me Too and a more disclosing culture. You increased funding to the sector by 10%. You did it across the board as well, just for, even though some areas needed more and others might have needed less. I just want to finish with one thing. There was 3,000 new millionaires in this country last year. There was 3,000 children got help in a domestic violence service. There's also over 3,000 children homeless. The idea that we don't have money to support services to assist women and men as well, and children who experience violence, is just simply not acceptable. And Women's Aid have already published a report in the last month saying that people they've surveyed said there's no point in going and taking a case. The majority said they probably wouldn't bother again. So what you're doing is completely insufficient. And we can only conclude that the international protests that are taking place on November 25th, which is going to be the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, should signal the trade union movement, community organisations and women's organisations should mobilise for a massive protest on that day and worldwide, because the politicians, the political establishment isn't taking any notice.
Thank you very much. Taoiseach.
Thanks very much, Deputy. Spending by the government is roughly increasing by about 4% a year. It's only in the last year or two that we've gone from deficit to surplus, that we're taking in as much in revenue as we spend, and government spending increases by about 4% a year. As you pointed out, in this area we've increased the budget by 10%, and I think that is a recognition of the priority by which we're putting on this issue. The fact that we're willing to increase resources for it at twice the rate that we're increasing funding for other areas, and indeed have frozen it or reduced it for some of the areas that you mentioned earlier. In terms of what we're doing, we're reforming the law. I've given you some examples of that. We are investing in education and public awareness campaigns. You've acknowledged that has led to an increase in women and men coming forward, and that's to be welcomed. We're also improving our data around this, which is really important too, and I know you've campaigned successfully for us to go ahead with a new study about sexual violence in Ireland, and that's being done. And also we're providing additional resources to the Gardaí and additional training to the Gardaí, which I mentioned earlier as well.
Thank you, Deputy.